And I'm going to let everybody in.
So they can hear us once they're in, can't they?
Yeah, they'll be able to hear all of us, yeah.
Okay.
All right. Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. We're waiting for a few other people to come in from the waiting room. We're a very big group tonight, so appreciate your patience as you come in from the waiting room. Lovely to see lots of you with your cameras on. Makes it all feel that little bit more like we are closer to being back together in one room when that's the case. So appreciate it. All right. Now that most of you are in, I think we should get started. So, sorry, just the last few people. All right. Thank you all so much for joining us this evening. I would like to begin tonight by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I am currently seated, the Yagara and Turrbal people. I pay my respects to elders past and present and acknowledge that this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. I am so pleased to be here with you tonight for this special discussion of the climate cure with Tim Flannery and Damon Gameau. Before I hand you over to our speakers this evening, I'd just like to quickly reiterate some of the information that I mentioned in the email that you were sent with your link to join tonight's event. So as you've all noticed by now, you've automatically been placed on mute and you will remain so throughout the evening. That's just to avoid any accidental disruptions because as I mentioned, we are a big group tonight, which is fantastic. It doesn't mean that Tim isn't wanting to answer your questions. He definitely is. If you have any questions to ask, you can send them to me via the chat box and then I will read them out later on in the evening. If you can't see the chat box, it should be towards the bottom left of your screen. If you still can't find it, then don't worry too much. I'm going to be posting the link that you can use to purchase your copies of The Climate Cure from us at Avid Reader in that chat box. And when I do, it will pop up. The place where you type your question will be visible then, and you can send them through to me. I encourage you to start sending them through as early as possible. As I've already mentioned a couple of times now, we're a big group. I want to get through as many of your questions as I can. And the sooner that you get in, the sooner the better. And so that's enough from me. I'd now like to introduce Tim Flannery. Tim is a scientist, an explorer, a conservationist, and a leading writer on climate change. He has held various academic positions, including visiting professor in evolutionary and organismic biology at Harvard University, director of the South Australian Museum, principal research scientist at the Australian Museum, professional fellow at the Melbourne Sustainable Society Institute, University of Melbourne, and Panasonic Professor of Environmental Sustainability, Macquarie University. His books include the award-winning international bestseller, The Weathermakers, Here on Earth, and Atmosphere of Hope. Flannery was the 2007 Australian of the Year. He is currently Chief Counselor of the Climate Council. In conversation with Tim tonight is Damon Gameau. Damon released his first documentary feature, That Sugar Film, in 2015. It became the highest grossing Australian documentary of all time in Australasia and won the 2015 ACTA Award for Best Documentary among many other accolades. That Sugar Book, the film tie-in, was published in more than 20 countries and 8 languages. The follow-up book, That Sugar Guide, also became a bestseller. Last year, Damon released his second feature documentary, 2040, which imagines how our future world would look if all the best environmental solutions that exist today were implemented right now. The accompanying book, 2040, A Handbook for the Regeneration, provides practical wisdom and 50 recipes to help readers make a difference, one small step at a time. And so, Tim and Damon, it is now my pleasure to hand over to you both for tonight's discussion.
Thank you, Emma Kate, and welcome to everyone. I would also just like to acknowledge that I'm on the lands of the Bundjalung Nation, the Arakwal people, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. And this is a great honour for me to speak to Tim tonight. I've been a fan of Tim's work since the early 2000s, reading Weathermakers. An Atmosphere of Hope was a huge inspiration for making 2040. If I had to describe Tim to someone, I would say that he is a purveyor of peril and possibility, which is a very difficult load to carry sometimes, but he manages to pull it off very eloquently, and we're very lucky to have him in this country. So welcome, Tim. Thanks for joining us tonight.
Thank you so much, Damon, and thanks for that introduction. I feel you're being a bit over generous, but and I love your purveyor of peril and possibility. I think that's probably about right.
So I thought, you know, I do have a bias, obviously, towards the glass half full and the optimism. Can we just, before we get into the deeper dive and talk about tipping points and methane and all those sort of things, can you just recount for people what an extraordinary last few weeks it has been in Australia for energy policy, some of the actions from states, but even some of our large corporations, what they've announced in the last few weeks. Can we just begin this evening on a nice positive note before we head elsewhere?
Sure. Look, you know, what we've seen, not just over the last few weeks, but over this year, has been increasing numbers of large corporations that are pulling away from fossil fuels, from investment in fossil fuels, having anything to do with them. And we're also seeing the state government in New South Wales, you know, developing a tremendous new energy policy. You know, it's a rare thing to see any policy that's accepted by the opposition, the government, and even the National Party in New South Wales. But that's what we got this week, which was just fantastic. It's quite astonishing. Victoria's made its own announcements about a whole series of investments in clean energy. And I really feel that we're just turning the corner now. You know, this is the first time that I can see all of the stars aligning. And of course, that's just Australia. The thing I should have mentioned, Damon, the big one is the Biden win at the US election. I mean, that will be huge. Yeah. You know, the US will be rejoining the Paris Agreement. We'll see some real leadership, I think, with John Kerry in that position. So I'm feeling kind of optimistic about the transition. It's just that we're coming at it so late.
Yeah. Do you think there with Biden, do you think there'll be some pressure? Will he exert some trade sanctions or something on countries that are lagging behind? Do you think they'll flex those muscles?
Well, it'll be interesting. Yeah. Look, it'll be interesting to see. The European Union have been talking about trade sanctions already because there's huge investment there in clean energy. You know, there was a talk a decade or so ago among Republicans, strangely enough, about trade sanctions based on carbon, with some of the people on the right of politics realising that something needed to be done and perhaps this was a way of achieving it. Whether those ideas will be revived under Biden, I really don't know, but I think there'll be a discussion, that's for sure. And it may be that they'll foreshadow this, maybe without going the full distance at this moment, but even the foreshadowing of it will be energising for quite a number of economies, I think.
Yeah, I was reading that only recently that even if they do get blocked in the Senate with some of these reforms they want to push through, there are other ways they can use different trade policies and executive orders to sort of bypass the Senate and get some of these things through. So there is cause for optimism there, I think.
Oh, for sure. And look, it's not just what's happening in the US either. In a lot of these economies, you know, the cheapest new form of energy is clean energy. So it's a great time to be making that transition. Yeah. You know, like in Australia, many of them are being held back by vested interests and so forth. But you know, some clear direction from the US might see that opposition weaken, I think.
Yeah. Although I will add, in true Australian form, just when you think we've got some momentum and the path is clear, we start talking about an EV tax, which is just very Australian in its
I know, I don't get that, Damon. It drives me nutty. I mean, just at the moment when we really need to be pushing EVs, what do they decide to do? Raise $1 million a year, 1 million, right? With an EV tax. I think, no.
And you see what's happened in other countries where they're incentivizing, they've taken off stamp duty, they're giving free toll road use, free parking in the cities. And that's why these European countries are just getting such a large uptake. So we could be doing it here, but unfortunately we're going the other way.
Yeah, that's one thing I really don't get. New South Wales, though, today announced they weren't going down that route, which was great. Yeah. So we might see a bit of a push through New South Wales. But you know, the thing about all of these transitions, Damon, as you know better than anyone, they've got to be done soon. We're running out of time. And so each step backwards is a doubly catastrophic at this particular moment in time.
Yeah. So let's maybe get to that. Just, I don't want to spend too long there, but let's just talk about, you know, recent studies that are emerging around sort of permafrost and methane in the Arctic, the intense warming there, the sort of reports about the Amazon becoming a savanna and what implications that could have for rainfall in North America and geopolitical tensions. Can you talk maybe about, you know, the peril part for a while, about, you know, without giving deadlines, the urgency that we are facing in this moment?
Yeah. Well, look, a lot of this, Damon, is being outlined in a new report that's being put together right now by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. That'll come out next year. And I know a number of the scientists involved in putting that report together. And really, the news is pretty chilling. You know, the situation is worse than we thought it was, is basically what it all adds up to. And the timelines we thought we had to deal with these problems are shorter than we'd want, you know. So it all adds up to the message being there's still time, but there's precious little of it. We really have to start making it this year. We can't have another Copenhagen meeting 2009. We can't have a false start Paris meeting. We actually have to start cutting emissions now at 8% per year, every year out to the end of the decade, to start, you know, just edging away from these tipping points that you just mentioned. Yeah. You know, they're all well known. We can see the permafrost melting. We can see the Arctic ice retreating year on year. We know that these are very real hazards, but the good news is there still is time to avoid them, but we really have to act now.
Yeah. So I guess bringing to some of the concepts you raise in your new book, which is terrific, by the way, this comparison that you've made to what we've been through this year with COVID, and I guess the response to science that so many countries around the world have done and initiated. Can you maybe talk about those parallels and what can be learned from the way we responded to COVID moving forward with climate? What are the key learnings, especially for our country?
Well, it was interesting, Damon. I started writing this book during the bushfires, you know, and this horrific situation was enveloping, and I was just struggling to write a book that would chart a way forward. You know, you don't want to write a depressing book, right? That's the last thing you want to do. But I was struggling to see that big picture of how we could deal with this. And then in March, we had the COVID pandemic really hit Australia, and we saw this incredible action by the government. I mean, we stopped flights from China back in February, and this had serious economic consequences for a whole series of sectors, the university sector being just one of them. And then by early March, the Australian government was calling a pandemic 12 days before the World Health Organization did so. So we were on the front foot from the start with this, you know. And then 13th of March, when the pandemic is doubling every 4 days and we have to act then or not at all, we have a lockdown. And we triumph over this disease. You know, a new form of government is invented, Damon. We've got this kind of, you know, the Prime Minister and all the premiers being a power block, doing fantastic things together. So as I started to observe this and unpick it, I thought, well, what are the lessons for climate change? What are the steps we need to do that we now see government absolutely can do? So what are they for climate change? And they're the same 3 steps, essentially, we saw with the pandemic. I mean, the first thing you've got to do when you're facing a situation like this is stop the spread, right? So that's why we came down so hard and fast on, you know, the lockdowns. With climate change, it's not quite as dramatic as a lockdown. All we need to do is cut our emissions 8% a year, every year between now and 2030. So if you think about doing that in your own life, you can see how that can be done. Every industry can do it. Our electricity sector can do it at a canter, as our Prime Minister would say. We could cut much more steeply than that if we wanted. And, you know, maybe transport electric vehicles will take a bit longer, but towards the end of the decade, we're going to have the capacity to start having a big impact there as well. So, you know, stop the spread. First thing, government should declare a climate emergency and stop the spread. Really simple stuff. We can do it. The second step is we have to make sure we've got sufficient capacity in our emergency departments or our emergency capacity as a whole to deal with the problems we've already created in the climate system. And they include things like the megafires we saw last summer, but also, you know, increasing heat waves, biodiversity loss, coastal erosion. You know, each one of them is a doable problem, but government seems to dither and doesn't seem to see them as being linked under this great umbrella of the climate threat. Whereas if we realise there's a climate emergency and then put our thought into how we deal with all of these things as they come up, we'll be in a really strong position, Damon, to work our way through this and come out with a robust society. You know, some of the challenges are big. The Great Barrier Reef's one, as you know more than most. I mean, you know, yes, it's a big challenge, but we can do things to increase the prospects of the Great Barrier Reef. So they're two of the steps. The third step is to create the equivalent of a vaccine. And I don't know whether you recall, but, you know, early on in this year, the scientists were saying, well, we don't know whether we can do it. But what we do know is that it's going to be really expensive. It's going to take quite a lot of time and research effort. And of course, the outcomes are uncertain. But here we are now, what, 8 months later, with success on the horizon. So in terms of climate, the vaccine is drawdown. It's using the Earth's natural systems to start re-exerting that balance that the Earth has created for itself and draw the CO2 out of the atmosphere. And we do that by protecting our forests and our biodiversity and our soils and taking care of our oceans and planting seaweed and using silicate rocks to start drawing, you know, excess gas out of the air, maybe even some direct air capture of CO2 for industrial purposes. We know we can do this, Damon, but without an emergency response, without a recognition of its importance, that vaccine will never be developed. It'll be like we lived with the common cold for decades without looking for a vaccine because it was, you know, we didn't think it was important. So we have to take this message that this is an emergency, and our efforts as government need to be organised around confronting these challenges. Yeah. Sorry, I've gone on a long time there, but
no, it's a beautiful analogy, and what it raised for me was that I think one of the troubling issues of COVID was just seeing how polluted our information ecology has been this year and how tricky it is to collectively make sense and move forward on certain topics. And I think we're going to see all sorts of dramas around the vaccine when that eventually comes, but there is an analogy there to climate change and how that sort of epistemic commons has been hijacked by different actors that are polluting that space. In your time, and I know especially you think of COP15 in Copenhagen, which was probably one of the great hijackings of that narrative. How do you see that we deal with that moving forward? People are so, there's no trust there. They don't know which story to believe. There's still so much insecurity and debate around climate. What's a way through that, do you think? Is nature just going to keep revealing itself and make us move forward? Or what are your thoughts on that, given what you've been through for the last 2 decades?
Yeah, well, look, that Copenhagen meeting was the most, oh God, it hit me like very few other things have, because I put 3 years into trying to make that meeting a success. I was chair of the Copenhagen Climate Council. And then to see this outright lie come out, the ClimateGate lie, and to see the impact that had on all of the presidents and all of the high officials attending, you know, many of whom didn't have a science background. So when they read in the newspapers, climate change is a hoax put together, you know, by scientists, and here's the proof, they tended to believe it. And it weakened the resolve of the meeting. It was a real tragedy. I think we're a bit more sophisticated these days in the way we deal with attempted hijackings like that. And we're also now in a position where climate impacts are a lived experience for many, many more people. It's not just a hypothetical issue anymore. You know, we've lived through the smoke and the heat waves, and we've lived through the coastal erosion and the biodiversity loss and all the rest of it.
Yes. Yeah.
So we're in a somewhat different position, but you know, it's still the case that the nasty gremlins lurk in the dark corners of the information ecology, you know, and the more darkness they can create, the better off they are.
Yeah.
So in a way, Damon, that's why I set up the Climate Council, because I wanted to have an entity that was authoritative, trustworthy, not, you know, just dealing with the facts, that could talk to normal people. And over 7 years, we've really helped, I think, build that trust. And I think we're now at a point where, you know, the great majority of Australians do want action on climate change. We're still a divided society, and that is deeply worrying. In fact, the one thing I think we've got to do, just to address the question you asked me, is we have to move together as a united society. So the people working in coal in Queensland, or gas, or coal in the Hunter Valley, they have to really know that we're with them, and that we're going to go through this transition without losing a single job. And, you know we can do that, Damon. I mean, Germany's done it. They've just announced their coal compromise. You know, not a single job will be lost in Germany from coal as they transition to cleaner resources. And when you go up to the coal areas, you can see how that can be done, because, I mean, well, the Hunter Valley is a great example. You know, you fly over the Hunter Valley in a helicopter, it looks like a moonscape. You know, and people have been paid to gouge holes in the earth for decades. Well, we're at a point now where people will be paid for decades to use those same bulldozers to start putting the landscape back, you know, and to be building things like pumped hydro and other facilities, and rejuvenating farmland and creating new economic opportunities. We know we can do this. The Germans have taught us how we do it. It's just a matter now of cutting through the bullshit, which says that without coal, you've got nothing, you know. While that bullshit lives, it's very, very hard to move together as a united society. But the moment we do create that unity, we'll be off and running, and we'll start moving very fast, I'm sure.
Yeah, couldn't agree more, mate. And in fact, a project I've been working on for the last 6 months has been looking at that, interviewing Australians in different communities right around the country, and asking them what kind of future or what kind of Australia they want to emerge from this time. And it's been so heartening to hear how many things we have in common, and even really conservative farmers talking about ecological restoration and rivers flowing again and greener hills, and people talking about Indigenous wisdom and community sovereignty around energy and food. So I do think there's like you said, we're close to a tipping point, and that there is a consensus now that we're ready to change and get on with things and move past all the bullshit, as you said. So I do think it's an exciting time for our country.
I do too. I think, do you mind me telling a little story out of the book, Damon? But it really touched my heart. You know, when I went up to Gladstone when I was Climate Commissioner, and that was now, you know, 7 years ago or so. And there was an audience full of, looked like coal miners to me. And there was one big bloke sitting up in the audience. He looked about 6'4", you know, big muscly bloke. I could see the coal dust in his skin, you know. And we gave our little presentation anyway. And the first hand up at question time was this bloke, you know. I thought, oh, we're in trouble now. We're going to really get it. But he said to me, he said, look, he said, thank you for your presentation. He said, I used to be a farmer before I went to work in the mines. He said, and I can see that climate change was one of the factors that contributed to my bankruptcy on the farm. And he said, look, I've got 2 daughters. We're struggling to hold things together. Can you tell me, am I doing the right thing by working in a coal mine? You know, and that you realize people just want solutions. Everyone has their own questions. And it was this incredible act of generosity. I was knocked back by it. I didn't know what to say to him, you know. I wish I'd said, well, look, you know, of course you've got to put your family first, but doesn't our society have to be behind you? Can't we come and help, you know, create a better future for all of you, everyone in those regions? Yeah. And that is the answer. That's what we have to do.
And do you feel like that, to a degree, has been a failure of the environmental movement sometimes, is that the dehumanizing of these people on this topic sometimes? I think we've put our own passions over the needs of these people sometimes, and that has caused all sorts of tensions, whereas a different approach, an understanding, a listening approach might have actually got more momentum a lot sooner. Do you think that might have been the case?
I really think so, Damon. You know, I think, look, a lot of people have been in the environment movement a very long time, and there was a period there where, you know, you were fighting to protect forests. People were chaining themselves to trees, and it was very confrontational and brutal. And, you know, I can understand completely why people who've lived that life see that there's an enemy, and then there's, you know, there's them, and it's a battle. And yes, it is, but we can't demonize other Australians, you know. We can see that, you know, the fossil fuel industry, sure, They're you know, there are people there who are spending money to mislead us, and we've got to call that out, and that's wrong. But the average worker in a coal mine in Australia, or you know, some other fossil fuel industry, they're fellow Australians that deserve our support. You know,
Yep.
we can't afford to make enemies of people like that.
Couldn't agree more, mate. So you've touched in the book how we need to, obviously the first step is to stop the bleeding. Let's stop putting the fossil fuels into the atmosphere. And then we've got to protect the carbon that's already in the system, which is obviously very important. But I really want to talk now about these drawdown potentials, ways that we can start sequestering large amounts of carbon. And obviously you and I could potentially nerd out on seaweed for a good couple of hours.
Yeah,
I've drunk the seaweed Kool-Aid and it's delicious and salty, and I'm going to drink it for the rest of my life. But can we maybe talk about some others? I know you mentioned, the silicate rocks, the capture, which is growing obviously as an industry. But I'm also curious as to why you left out soil in the book, which is obviously has so many other cascading benefits for water and the health of our food. So just love to get your take on that. Sure.
Look, I didn't concentrate a lot on regenerative farming. In part, Damon, I was exhausted by the time I'd finished that book. It was such a tough year, and I wanted to get the basic message out. But soil is incredibly important. You're so right. Can I just, go back to my great hero in all of this, who's David Attenborough, and A Life on Earth. I don't know whether you've seen it, but, at the end of that, he just says, we just have to rewild our planet. Yeah. And it's kind of Gandhi-esque, this wonderful Gandhi-esque statement of what needs to be done, that below it sits a whole lot of things that are so common sense, but so powerful. If we can just regrow our forests, not just protect what we've got, but regrow them, rewild areas. If we know how to concentrate our food production. We know how wasteful a lot of it is. If we can have regenerative agriculture back in place that lets us regenerate our soils and our biodiversity on the used lands. And again, we know how to do that. The great farmers of the world are doing that sort of thing, we can see that the land can be a tremendously powerful engine for drawing CO2 out of the atmosphere. Now, it won't get us all the way, but it's incredibly important. Yeah. So then we've got many other ways that the Earth draws CO2 out of the atmosphere is obviously through the oceans and plants in the oceans, seaweed. I'll park that one, Damon. We'll get on to that in a minute. Yeah. But also these silicate rocks. And, Queensland is unbelievably rich in silicate rocks. You have some of the great deposits there. Australia is a great mining nation. We know how to dig up rocks. There was a study published just a few months back now that showed that if we just use the trimmings of the rocks that we already mine, just all of the rock waste, we could be drawing 2 gigatons of CO2 out of the atmosphere per year, just using the waste. Wow. It's a fantastic thing. I mean, these rocks, they if you grind them up into a sand-like consistency and spread them on a beach, as they decompose, they just draw CO2 out of the atmosphere, and it ends up as carbonate in the ocean. It's chemical magic, but it's the way the Earth has balanced its CO2 over billions of years, probably. Yeah. And we can accelerate it. I mean, the big problem we have today, of course, is you go to any quarry and, it's all being run through fossil fuels. Yeah. It doesn't have to be that way. It won't be that way in future. Yeah. And as we unlock those ways of using clean energy to extract these rocks, we can start really making an impact.
Great. Mate, before we get on to seaweed, can you just, I know I've just been reading some interesting research recently around the hydrological cycle of the Earth and what role the water might be playing in sort of a temperature regulation. And just, we talk about trees a lot. And I think a lot of people might just see them as carbon sequesterers, but this transpiration process that is creating this moisture in the atmosphere, and, the rain almost needs the trees. It sends out this little bacteria. Yeah. Have you done much of a deep dive onto that in terms of what role that water cycle plays in a heating or cooling effect?
Sure. Well, I mean that transpiration is creating a heat engine. It's cooling, the surface of those plants and cooling the area around. And so the moisture goes up, it rises into the atmosphere where it loses heat to the outer atmosphere, and then it returns as rain, And the forests of the Earth depend upon that. And, in places like the Amazon, 80% of the rainfall that nourishes the Amazon comes from the trees itself. And it's because there's a westerly wind blowing, the whole time, off the Atlantic and over the Pacific Mountains. And so moisture comes in, it falls in the eastern Amazon, the plants transpire that moisture, it forms clouds, the clouds rain again, and that happens 5 times. The water's recycled 5 times before it goes over into the Pacific coast. So, I mean, you know, this is the way the earth works. And that's why Attenborough's words just ring so resonantly with me, that this, you know, if we let the planet heal itself, it will do the job for us. It's what created this wonderful world. I mean, biodiversity, the forests of the world, the oceans, created the very atmosphere we breathe.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, and if we didn't have biodiversity, the oceans would be a toxic stew. It's
right.
life that keeps these organs of our planet in a usable form.
Yeah, I'll just quickly, if I can, share the story of a mutual friend of ours, Nigel Sharp, and I've just spent the last 6 days filming a property they have in rural Victoria, and what they've done is fenced off an area of 2,000 acres and put 18 kilometres worth of fence and got rid of all the fox and the rabbits, and they're starting to reintroduce the native Australian animals, the quolls and the bandicoots and the batongs, and just to see even where they've brought back the bandicoots, that they are a natural soil engineer, and the way they burrow into the soil and they overturn the microbes, and that's pulling more carbon in and unlocking these seed banks. And all these native grasses are coming back that they didn't even know were there, that are all sequestering carbon and putting it down in the soil. So again, it's what you're speaking to of this whole system, whole ecosystem restoration is the way we're going to sequester the carbon. It isn't this reductionist method of just doing one thing. We have an opportunity to kickstart all these ecosystems that have done it for millions of years. And there, you walk around those properties and you can feel the difference, and it feels alive, and the land is living, and you feel like this is where we should be getting our food from, and this is how we should be spending our weekends in this kind of environment.
It's so interesting, David. I'm just delighted you went and met Nigel and went and saw what he's doing at Tiverton, because, you know, it's such a contrast to the traditional farming. I mean, I met a farmer that lives quite close to Nigel down there in the Western District of Victoria, and he said to me, look, we make a living from poisoning the land twice a year. And that's what it is. It's, you know, putting sprays on the land twice a year. And when you think about what that does, when you think about those, you know, Roundup and whatever else that you use, some people use it to brown off their crop, you know, so it's all uniformly ready to go. And you think, you can't, this is a living system. It's not some sort of, I don't know, automaton, you know, that you can put poison into and then hope it'll keep on coming good. I mean, the soil is a living thing. The green, the carpet of green is a living thing. If you poison that twice a year, you will end up destroying the capacity for productivity. So what people like Nigel and others have done, have found a way around that. They've found that you don't need poison. If you want to get rid of the grubs out of your pasture, bandicoots are even better than poison. You know? They do it. They give you something lovely in the environment. So they're not young people, all of these farmers, but my God, they have done years of work. And if any of you have read Charles Massey's book, you know, The Song of the Reed Warbler, and see the mental agony he went through coming to this conclusion, because, I mean, you know, he's from the land. His dad was from out at Casterton. And, you know, the way that the previous generation lived was, you know, a good weekend was going out, gassing some rabbit burrows and ring-barking a few trees, you know, improving your land. That's right. And so there's a huge mental shift from that 1930s attitude to where we are today, and it's not easy. So,
no, and I think what's great there, though, is that some of these practices are now proving far more economically viable than the old system. And even to go to Tiverton and see, because the sheep are getting this consistent protein from the healthy soil the whole year round, the fibre of their wool is now really taut and rigid, and so they're getting a great price for it from a European market. So the farmers there, there's business in biodiversity, which is a real tipping point, I think, and a lot of farmers are starting to see that.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that fibre story is great. I would never have guessed that Nigel's sheep would be so profitable, because they didn't have any breaks in the wool due to malnutrition, effectively, where, you know, the soil's no good. But yeah, it's fantastic. And, it is. Yeah, we'll see lots more of that sort of thing, I think.
So let's quickly, because I know we're going to get to some questions, but I can't leave you without having a bit of a nerd out on seaweed. So I often think that, you know, back in the 60s, there were groups of people meeting together to talk about this sort of solar panel technology or the future of wind turbines. And it feels like now there's pockets of ocean engineers and experts coming together to start talking about how we can scale up seaweed is a massive solution for sequestering carbon and all the other things it does. Can you just give us a bit of an overview of where we are at in terms of a global collaboration on seaweed as a solution?
Sure. Well, I should just explain, Damon, why seaweed is so important to me. So it's important for a number of reasons. One is that it grows really fast. So seaweed can grow 1 metre a day, some kinds of seaweed, and therefore it absorbs a lot of CO2. And also, Charles Darwin called the kelp forests of Patagonia the ocean's rainforests. They're biodiverse. They shelter so much life. And thirdly, we've got a good place to put the carbon, which is in the deep ocean. Now, a lot of seaweed already reaches the deep ocean naturally. It just gets washed off submarine plateaus or down submarine canyons, and it ends up in the deep ocean where the carbon in that seaweed just stays. It stays down there. And I know there's a lot of concern with some people, will we damage the deep ocean? I mean, we really have to take that seriously, Damon, as we pursue seaweed. But it's useful to know that the deep ocean's so big that if we took half of the CO2 that's currently in the atmosphere, so at about 412 parts per million, so if you took 212 of that, sunk it into the deep ocean, you'd only increase the concentration of CO2 in the deep ocean by 2%. Right? The deep ocean is vast. It's vast, so we can put seaweed into it and, deep sea holothurians will eat it and the carbon will stay down there. So that's why it's important. So where are we at? Well, I think we're at a stage now where people have realised the potential of seaweed, not just as a crop for human food or anything else, but as a means of drawdown. And there are a number of very brave individuals experimenting with this. And I'm in touch with a number of them around the world, but there's one guy in South Africa off the Namibian coast who's put his own money into growing seaweed farms, which is fantastic because, kelp is endangered in many places, so growing it out there is great. There's another man I just heard from today from New Zealand who is, he is just put in a very large grant to work out how much seaweed actually gets into the deep ocean from his work, and which is fantastic because without that basic science, we're sort of grasping at straws, So I think we're at the point where there is it's like a deep undersea upwelling coming towards the surface, It's working its way up. There's lots of people who are really putting their money and their effort behind this. But we haven't got to the point of crystallization yet where we're seeing a demand for proper government policy, for example, in this area.
Yeah, it's even our the project we could help kickstart with 2040, which was with the University of Tasmania. They did a sort of a bit of an incubation period to try and breed a resilient, tough seaweed that could last in the warming waters down in Tas. And we planted that alongside one of the fish pens late last year, and then did a control study a bit further away. And we got sent through the photos only a couple of days ago that even the one next to the fish pen is almost 10 metres tall now off the feed lines there. And it's actually been absorbing the nitrates coming off that pen and actually growing faster than the control area. And they've survived 11-metre waves this year. So the next step is to build that platform at 100-metre scale and try that upwelling process in the deep waters there.
See, Damon, this is regenerative agriculture in the ocean. This is what you're taking a waste product, nitrates from a fish farm, you're using it to grow seaweed, you can capture the CO2. It's closing the loop. It's brilliant.
And so as you know, there's so much innovation in this space now. I had someone pitch an idea the other day about using azolla ferns, which, as you know, played a huge role in the Earth's carbon. But these ideas of putting them into the river systems to absorb the nitrates out of the water, and then allowing the farmers to scoop them up downriver and start feeding them to their livestock or putting them into the soil again to use these natural filters. So there's some experiments going on in the Mississippi and in China at the moment to use those ferns as a filter.
That's amazing. In Queensland, the Queenslanders, you're very fortunate because you have one of the world's leading thinkers about seaweed at James Cook University, a guy called Rocky Denise, and he's developed these great big seaweed filters really for use on sewage treatment plants, where you can grow seaweed and also the water, then all the nutrients are removed and you get absolutely clean water coming out. In fact, they use them on fish farms up there at the moment, and the water that's coming into the fish farms is dirtier than the water that goes out because of these fabulous filters. And you get this great seaweed, And you can char it and use it as a soil amendment. You can make a fertilizer with it, a liquid fertilizer. It's it's again closing the loop. And so this sort of stuff is just critical, I think, to the future of the planet.
It is, mate. One more question before we go, because you just touched on it there, and it came up in your book as well, is that what we've just talked about, obviously, is this idea of a biological geoengineering, if we're going to get back and use nature's sort of drawdown solutions. I got a sense that you're starting to shift a little bit and be a little bit more open-minded to some of the more sort of man-made technology geoengineering ideas that are floating around. Is that purely because we've got to such a late stage of inaction that we are potentially going to need to do something like this to avoid some kind of catastrophe?
Look, as the patient gets sicker, you start contemplating more and more drastic interventions, don't you? So if you've got an very early stage of gas gangrene, you might just take a toe, but if it's later, you've got to take the whole limb, And unfortunately, the climate problem's moving so fast now that I think, in my mind, I'm preparing myself to take risks that would otherwise be quite hair-raising, So these are some of the ideas include, say, putting sulfur into the stratosphere to try to stabilize the Arctic ice cap. And, that might sadly be necessary. Will it work? We don't know. This is, but Damon, the problem is, I was just looking at the figures for what's called biomass for our planet. And so for all mammals, humans alone are 36% of the biomass of all mammals on our planet, right? So there's about 8,000 species. I don't know what it is now. We're 36%. For our domestic livestock, that's another 60%. So all up, we are 96%. So every elephant, every whale, every kangaroo is just 4%, right? So we are now so dominant on this planet that we have to take up the mantle of geoengineers in a way. We know that what we do will have a big impact. If we keep on being destructive, we will destroy our planet. If we can move in sensible ways to try to unpick the damage, to try to strengthen the planet, clearly we'll have a better future. And geoengineering, I see it as it's like a stopgap, an emergency stopgap that we might need to use. And if we might need to use it, don't you think we should understand it? We should be doing research at least to let us know what are the consequences of this. Now, it would be horrific to be discussing this a decade from now, Damon, where we've got no Arctic ice and people saying, what are we going to do? And, we could have said, well, a decade ago, we could have been investigating what the consequences would be of using sulfur. Would this work? What are the deleterious effects? So I just think we've got to open our eyes and start thinking about this problem very holistically.
Yeah, it's a tough one, isn't it? Because we don't have a great track record of interfering with nature and coming out better than we started. It's a really delicate one. But as you said, if people understand the urgency, they might be more open to at least discussing it and debating it and looking. And like you said in the book, the worst case scenario is if one country goes rogue and just decides to do it, the instability that would create would be not even worth thinking about.
Well, the point about the sulfur is it's cheap and effective. We know that. There's been studies of volcanoes putting sulfur in the air. It's within the remit, the abilities of a single individual to pay for sulfur to be put into the stratosphere, and there's no rules on Earth preventing it. So it might not be a country, it might be an individual. So this is the world we're moving into.
Fucking hell. The Bezos sulfur plane. I can see it now.
Yeah, exactly.
Hey, thanks, Tim. I might throw back to Emma Kate and let's see. I'm sure there's some terrific questions coming through from the audience here tonight.
Yeah, thanks, Damon. Thank you, Tim. This is an absolutely great conversation. And as you suspected, it's prompted lots of questions. So everybody, thank you for sending them through. I'm going to do my best to get through as many as possible. So a lot of people interested in the seaweed talk. So I'm going to ask a couple of those questions to start with. So Eleanor wanted to know whether growing seaweed can create a monoculture like you can get on land, and what does it do to the ecosystem? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Look, potentially you could create a monoculture. I guess we see it in the Sargasso Sea where you get one species of seaweed. It's home to a lot of other organisms, but it is one species spread over a very large area. And I think when we contemplate these initiatives, we have to do it with a precautionary approach. So we have to actually, investigate as we go with these things. I guess the point about seaweed is, though, that we're not going to end up with an area the size of South Australia as a seaweed farm anytime soon. We'll grow incrementally, bit by bit. And as we grow, we need to learn, and we need to have really good science and really good regulation, quite frankly, informing what we do in those areas. So I'm really fully aware that there are all sorts of unintended consequences for any of these interventions. But we can see that we're heading down the wrong path very quickly. And I think we just need to investigate and see what we can do to allow the earth to heal itself, whether it be with seaweed or silicate rocks or whatever else.
Mm-hmm.
I was amazed to learn, Tim, too, that there's 14,000 different types of seaweed as well. So that it's not about just growing a particular type in a region, it's actually being very aware of which region requires that seaweed.
Yeah, it's absolutely right, Damon. It's incredible that Australia, or Southeastern Australia, is the world centre for biodiversity of seaweed too. We're so lucky.
We've actually got Joe Kelly, who's the CEO of Australian Seaweed Institute here. And Joe says, "Hi, Tim. We've developed an industry plan for the Australian seaweed industry to reduce carbon emissions by almost 10% by reducing methane emissions from cattle, create around 9,000 jobs and boost the economy by 1.5 billion. It's a win-win-win. But we need government support for industry establishment. How can we get on the radar as an important part of the journey to zero emissions while providing a positive new industry for Australians?"
Wow, well, that's a great question. Look, in a way that the ideal situation would be to have a government, a federal government in Australia that recognised the urgency of the situation and reorganised itself around the climate challenge. So if they did that, then quite naturally seaweed would be right up there as one of these great opportunities. But I guess if you're sort of saying, oh, climate change isn't all that important, why should we be bothering with this? Why don't we just give some more drought relief to our farmers on land? If you're living in the old world, then that kind of view can make sense, So to me, it is tied up with this sense that we have to fundamentally change the way we're interacting with our planet. That climate change is going to be the new organising principle in a way for a lot of government effort. I wish I had a shortcut. I wish I could give you a phone number where you could speak to someone at the federal level who was sympathetic, but I don't have that. I think it's just going to be more hard work pushing on. But you're quite right. I mean, what seaweed can do for methane emissions alone in cattle is potentially absolutely astonishing. Yeah. We can be changing things very fundamentally if the focus was there. But you need a science literate government.
Thank you. So Climate for Change have asked, Tim, do you have any thoughts about any dangers of rushing into the hydrogen economy? They've said a recent article published in The Conversation by Graham Pearman argued that further research needs to be done into how hydrogen leaks from pipelines could potentially disrupt the methane cycle in the atmosphere and exacerbate warming. This was the first that I've heard about this, and it got me a bit concerned. Hopefully we can make green hydrogen work without causing another problem.
Well, look, thanks for that question. And it's really emblematic of the issues that we'll face as we start developing new approaches. So I read Graham's article too. I think it is something we need to start investigating. But again, we're not going to be at the scale where we're going to see planetary impacts from that for some years to come yet. So the time to start doing that research is now as we develop the hydrogen economy. And I don't think we can afford to pull back from the hydrogen economy because it's incredibly important in terms of weaning us off coking coal for steel production, for example, for fertilizer use, natural gas for fertilizer use, and a whole series of other things. So let's investigate as we go along, learn as we go, I think is what we're going to have to do as we develop this new approach to the planet. The one thing we know we can't do is continue as we are, right? So we have to start changing. We have to take these warnings from our scientists seriously and investigate them thoroughly. And if it turns out that we produce too much hydrogen or too much is leaking away, then that's a problem. That's clearly going to be a challenge. May not be an insurmountable one, but it may be a challenge. It'll limit the extent we can use hydrogen.
Thank you. We've had another question. We've had one from Jan and Steve, which is about other complications, which is the unspoken complication to the climate crisis is unsustainable population growth. Each of us contributes a carbon footprint. How can effective reduction of emissions be achieved if we are unsustainably adding more feet? So that's from Jan and Steve.
Sure. Well, the thing that's most infuriating about that is we know how to fix the climate problem. You just make sure that the poorest women in the world get a better economic deal and get more autonomy and a better quality of life. It's not that hard. It's not that expensive to do. I still don't understand why we as a planet are not focusing on that. So if you're interested in population, women in developing countries is got to be the focus. But we can't afford to wait for population change to fix this climate problem. I mean, the climate problem is right now, right? Population's a bit like the Titanic. It takes a long time to turn around, but the pointy end of the climate problem where we're nudging up against these tipping points is right now. So we need to do two things at once. We need to give people in developing countries, particularly women, a better quality of life, and we need to deal with the emissions as well. And we can do that. We're very capable as a species. So it's a matter of orientation. What do you believe is important in life? What are we going to fund? What are we going to actually do?
Thank you. Sean has asked about your thoughts on the need for an ecocide law to promote reductions in those emissions. What are the barriers to this?
Wow, an ecocide law. Yeah, that's look, I'm not a lawyer and I don't know how that would work. I guess my sense of it is we're better off setting ourselves a target. I mean, I would love Australians to say 8% a year, that's what we have to do. If the federal government doesn't want to do it, well, we'll do it without them. But let's all of us reduce our emissions individually, in the businesses we're in the states we live in, by 8% a year, you know? And that sort of target, it'll buy us some time. It'll let us work together to solve the problem. You know, ecocide law, yeah, I'm struggling to imagine how it would work, but as I said, I'm not a lawyer.
Thank you. Sarah has asked if you have done much investigating into First Nations climate solutions and if you could talk a little bit about this.
Look, I have done some, but mostly in terms of fire. So I've been involved for a while with some groups who are looking at using traditional fire management to limit the impacts of bushfires, for example. And you know what we're seeing there is that we know that for many, many thousands of years, Indigenous people did a fantastic job in Australia of managing bushfires or managing fire just through fire stick farming effectively. But that in the last 200 years, the land has changed a lot. We've had introduced plants and introduced animals, and massive intervention changed the nature of ecosystems. And I think what we're learning is that we need to come together in a new synthesis that involves that Indigenous knowledge, but also modern, scientific knowledge of the way ecosystems work, Western science knowledge, to produce a synthetic view that lets us perhaps work in this new synthetic environment that we live in, or syncretic environment, really.
Sorry, Tim, you've gone on mute. Sorry, I think that was my mistake.
Sorry.
Apologies, everybody, that was my mistake.
But anyway, I'm unmuted. Yeah, so look, I think Indigenous people have a tremendous amount to offer. Again, just say we need to work together. We need to use that knowledge as well as Western science to solve some of our problems. Thank
you. Sorry, I was trying to avoid the dog barking in the background on my end. We've been asked actually by Emma, who says, I'm studying a Master of Internet of Things, and I'd like for both Tim and Damon to speak on this generally, if you could, how this could and will be a part of the solution, perhaps building on some of the info in 2040.
Go ahead, Damon.
I'll jump in first. Well, I guess I have mixed feelings about the term because sometimes it can be a vehicle for just much more economic growth, which is probably not the ideal scenario for our predicament we're in. But I think what is emerging is some intelligent uses of that architecture. And I think that it allows us for the first time to have energy independence and sovereignty. So that idea of sharing energy, which is happening in a lot of communities. I've seen models now where the blockchain is being used to create supply chains so people can scan a barcode. Like in Taiwan, you can do this. You scan a fish, for example, and the blockchain will tell you all the supply chains, how the fish was treated, how it was caught. So it's creating this radical transparency around some of our food, which I think is going to be really important, especially as we tell that carbon soil story and the life in the soil, that people will really be able to see the quality of their food, which will be an incentive for farmers to start growing that food. And yes, driverless cars, obviously we put that in the film because it was the only way I saw to us to reduce the cars on the roads. We're looking at 1 billion extra cars, even if they're electric by 2040, which in terms of resources would just be catastrophic. Even if it's dealing with the emissions, we've still got to create all those materials. So I did see that there was an option there of having these fleets of ideally community-owned vehicles where people could have a say in that and rent out their car and actually be using this shared economy or actually more of a circular economy. So like with any tool, there are different ways of using it. And I think some of the Internet of Things will be not ideal for us, but I do think there are some positives amongst it.
Great, thank you. Sorry, Tim, did you want to add to that?
Look, I guess I'm with Damon on that one. It's just, I think a lot of it depends upon what's in our hearts and minds, you know, how we use that economy of things. We can use it to keep on earning more and more money and building bigger and bigger mansions and, you know, whatever else, second, third, fourth homes and, you know, yachts and whatever you want. Or you can try to lead a better life. So it's very much what we're about. I think what we think is hugely important.
Thank you. And because I'm conscious of the time, I'm going to have to make this one my last question. Thank you all again so much for listening in and for all of your great questions and comments. There were so many. It was really difficult to pick. This one's come up several times, worded quite differently by different people, but ultimately it's a thank you for how much positivity you've both brought to this conversation, and asking the question of what we can do on an individual basis to make significant change beyond adding our voices to activism.
Can I jump in there, Damon? Because I've been asked this a bit. I think what we have to do is change the politics of the country. We've won the battle at most of the council levels, at the state level. They're all very pro clean energy, but there's still 25 people in our federal parliament or thereabouts who are stymieing action. And I was involved last year with Zali Steggall's campaign in Warringah, getting rid of Tony Abbott and putting Zali Steggall in. You know, if we'd have had 2 other people as successful as Zali, we'd be facing a different world today, because it'd be a minority government that'd be beholden to, you know, people who really care about climate change. So I think we just have to start challenging people, and they will become disempowered even in this parliament as their base starts to decay. I know that people like Craig Kelly, for example, have got a huge push against them in Sutherland, where, you know, people just want someone who will represent their view and their concerns about climate change, not the person they've got. So if we can just get behind that, don't be scared of getting involved in politics. Get involved, be heard, make change, and we will triumph.
Thank you. Damon, did you have anything you wanted to add to that before?
Only very briefly, I agree with everything Tim said, and he said it beautifully. But I think sometimes we can be very prescriptive in this space and tell everyone to do a certain thing. And I think it's about finding your own individual agency and finding that thing that lights you up, whether it's in food or oceans or educating women or girls or energy. Like if you actually go along with the thing that you're passionate about, you're much more likely to see it through. You're more likely to talk about it with friends and family. They will feel that passion, and who knows who you might bring along for the journey. But to understand, as Tim said, that this is the moment to step up. We really are right at that precipice. and it's about all of us finding that agency, talking about it, helping the scientists, help them to infuse it into culture. And we do that by sharing things online and telling stories and writing songs about it and making art about it. We can't leave it only to people like Tim and the scientists. We all have to play a role in making this change.
You're so right, Damon. Go with your sharpest tool.
Lovely. Thank you both so much. This has been a phenomenal discussion. Thank you again, everybody, for your great questions and comments. It's been an absolute pleasure to host. Damon and Tim, thank you so much. I'm going to now ask you all to take yourselves off mute so that you can join me in thanking Damon and Tim for this discussion. So you now should all be allowed to take yourself off mute. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye,
Thank
guys.
you.
Bye. Have a lovely rest of the evening.
Fabulous. Thank you.
All right.